How is the Renters' Right Act going to affect you as a renter? 5 things you need to know about the Renters' Right Act that will affect you as a renter. So, the first good news is this is the end of no fault eviction. You might have heard of Section 21 in the past. So, basically, Section 21 just means the landlord could serve you a notice, usually 1 month's notice, to ask you to vacate the property. And the landlord doesn't have to give you any reasons. The Renters' Right Act is putting an end to this, which is very good news for renter because it means you have more certainty as to how long you can live in the property. Doesn't mean that the landlord can't ask you to leave the property. The landlord could still ask you to leave the property under Section 8, which covers these 4 sub points under this main point about end of no fault eviction. The Section 8 eviction would cover things such as if the landlord or their family would like to move back into the property or they're planning to sell the property. But even then, under that particular condition, the landlord will have to give you 4 months' notice before you are legally obliged to leave the property. So that's the first thing. And also, there is quite a lot of caveat to it. So if the landlord is asking you to vacate the property under that clause in Section 8, meaning the landlord or his or her family is planning to move back to the property or they're planning to sell the property, the landlord can't then re-let the property or market the property for the next 12 months. So you can be assured that the landlord is not trying to play some sort of games with you and say, oh, I'm planning to sell the property and oopsie daisy, I'm not planning to sell the property and I'm going to rent it to somebody at a higher rent. That is no longer allowed. Or rather, it makes it a lot more difficult for the landlord to do that. The landlord could still ask you to vacate the property under Section 8 eviction. So we talk about landlord wanting to move back to the property. Other clauses in Section 8 eviction would include things such as if you haven't been paying your rent. In the past, the rule is if you haven't been paying your rent for 2 months, the landlord could give you 2 weeks notice to vacate the property. Whereas under the new Renters' Right Act, the landlord will have to wait for 3 months before you stop paying your rent. So you can effectively not pay your rent for 3 months. And even then, the landlord is required to give you 4 weeks notice before he or she is legally allowed to ask you to vacate the property. So in that sense, you have a bit more right. Of course, this is not a video to ask anybody not to pay their rent. But this is just so you know, this is your right as a tenant. And the landlord could still evict you under Section 8, and it covers things such as if you have done any damages to the property, in which case the landlord is allowed to ask you to leave the property ASAP, or if you have evidence of antisocial behavior, in which case the landlord could take actions immediately. So again, please do not do that. You do not want to be evicted from a property and leave a horrible record on your name. So that's the first main big change that I think would impact most tenants, in that you definitely have a lot more assurance, right? You would be in a situation where you just move into a property and you decorated it beautifully, and next thing you know, 2 months later, the landlord asks you to leave. It's just really disruptive to your life. So in this case, with the new Tenants' Right Act, at least for the first 12 months, you are sure that you can live in the property for at least 12 months. So this clause is asymmetric in that the landlord will have to wait till 12 months after you sign a new lease, but you could serve the landlord a notice right from day one. Uh, yeah, I know this is like the Renters' Right Act is highly favorable to renters. Let's say you move into a new rented property and oopsie daisy, for some reasons you change your job, you broke up with your boyfriend, or whatever reasons it is, you could pretty much serve the landlord a notice and you can be out of the property in 2 months time. So that's highly favorable to you, but not to the landlord. So this is something that I think a lot of tenants would welcome. So there are other ways where the landlord might have to ask you to leave the property, and they cover things such as redevelopment and a few other additions that I come through that I don't think is applicable to most people. But if you're interested in the fine details, I've attached my link below. I've come through the website for all of this information. So if you appreciate the information thus far, please click a like and a subscribe. Okay, so the next question you might ask is, how is that going to affect me if I already have an existing AST, an assured short hold tenancy? Basically, this means if your current assured short hold tenancy has an end clause, the end clause will be void. And if your current assured short hold tenancy has any break clause, it also means that the break clause will be void. Because think about it this way: break clause effectively is a reaction to you being locked into a tenancy for 6 months, 12 months, so on and so forth. So if you have signed a contract 3 months ago and there is a break clause, basically that just means the break clause no longer applies from 1st of May onward. Pretty much from 1st of May onward, you can serve the landlord notice, and within 2 months' time, you're out of that property. So that's good news for you. The second change with the renters' right bill is the landlord could only raise rent once a year, once every 12 months. And the landlord must give you 2 months' notice before he or she is allowed to raise the rent. And if you do not think that the raise in rent is justifiable, you could actually bring the landlord to the first tier tribunal. And it's up to the first tier tribunal to decide whether the raise is in line with market condition or not. And God knows how long that's going to take the first tier tribunal to make that decision. So you could actually buy yourself more time. And as soon as the first tier tribunal make a decision, let's say the first tier tribunal decide that yes, the raise in rent is justified, the new rent will only start from the day the first tier tribunal made that decision. And if the first tier tribunal decided that you are under some sort of stress, like the first tier tribunal actually have the power to defer the raise in rent by 2 months. So this is very good news for tenants, especially if you are fearful of the landlord just increasing the rent nilly-willy, which we have seen in the past. And one thing to note is the landlord cannot raise rent by any other means. It means if your current AST has a rent escalation clause built in, that clause is void as well. So the landlord can't, let's say you sign a contract 5 years ago, and 5 years ago, the AST says the landlord is allowed to raise the rent 5% a year. Basically, you can stay in your property and that clause will be void. So next time round, if the landlord would like to raise rent by another 5%, and if you don't think that 5% is justifiable, you could effectively raise it to the first tier tribunal and let them decide whether a 5% rent increase every 12 months is valid or not. Oh, also, just on that note about 12 months, if let's say your landlord raised your rent last year, you bring the landlord to the first tier tribunal, and then the first tier tribunal decided that, okay, the increase in rent is justifiable. Let's say there is a gap of 2 months between when the landlord served you notice to raise the rent to the point where the first tier tribunal decided that the rent increase is justifiable. The 12 months starts from the point where the first tier tribunal decided that the rent increase is justifiable. So effectively, the landlord could only raise rent 14 months from the last time the landlord raised their rent. So pay attention to the timeline like this because it affects how frequently you need to fork out extra money to pay your rent. The third change in the renters' right bill is related to the second point that I just covered, in that the landlord and the estate agents are not allowed to encourage bidding war for rent or accept a rent that is higher than what was being advertised. So let's just say an example of you come across this really beautiful one-bedroom flat somewhere in London that is asking for £1,800. And you see that there are 9 other people viewing this flat and you really want this flat. You can't put in an offer that offers the landlord £1,900. That is legally not allowed. And also the landlords and the estate agent can't call other people up and say, hey, this so-and-so offered me £1,900. Would you like to offer me £2,000 for this flat? That behavior is not allowed. On paper, this sounds good. In practice, what I think some landlords would do is maybe in the past, I rent out the flat for £1,800. Because of this new act coming in, what I might do is I'm just going to advertise the flat for £2,000 if I know that this flat is really popular. And then I will accept an offer that is slightly lower than £2,000. That way I can still increase the amount of money that I get from this flat. How I think that would impact you as a tenant is you might see a flat that is slightly out of your budget, right? Maybe in the past you could rent something similar for £1,800 and now it's advertised for £2,000. Don't let that deter you as a tenant. It could be just a tactic for landlords to use to make sure that they are not going against the law. So I would say if you see a flat that you really like, come 1st of May onward. Even if it's a little bit out of your budget, there's nothing to stop you from calling up the estate agent and say, what's the rent that the landlord is willing to accept? Because I know you're not allowed to accept a rent that is even £2,001. So, tell me a figure, right? And then we work from there. That way it opens up the possibility of flats that you could potentially rent. Fourth point, landlords are not allowed to accept advance payment more than a month of rent. And there is a bit of gray area. So when I say gray area, basically for any new leases, the landlords can only accept 1 month's rent in advance. Anything more than that, that's not legally allowed. But there is a gray area when it comes to existing rent. Let's say your existing rent says that you pay your rent in advance every 3 months, 6 months, or even per year. The rule is quite vague about whether the landlord will still require you to do the same, or whether you can do the same to assure that you like to live in the property. So that's one area that is quite unclear. So we'll see how that pan out. I'm pretty sure within the first 6 months, there will be cases where there might be some dispute when it comes to cases like this, and we'll see what the decision is at that point. The last point would be very beneficial for people who have kids or are on benefits, and maybe even people who have pets. So the landlords could no longer discriminate tenants with children or on social benefits. That's obviously fantastic news, especially if you have trouble renting as a family. For people with pets, that's a bit of a gray area. With the new act, it means that the landlord will have to give requests to have pets serious consideration unless your pets are illegal, unless the head lease. So let's say your landlord is a leaseholder and then there is a freeholder, and the freeholder stipulates that the leaseholder cannot allow to have pets in the building. So in that case, it's not the landlord's decision, it's the freeholder's decision. In that circumstances, you still can't have pets in your rented property. Or if other tenants in the rented property have evidence of being severely allergic to pets. So generally, that's very good news for tenants. And at this point, if you find my 5 points useful, please click a like and a subscribe. Let me then talk about the immediate impact on the rental market in the UK. I think what you could do as a tenant before the 1st of May is, if you are a high quality tenant, this is actually a very good opportunity for you to secure a good flat. Because if I were a landlord, I would start thinking about what's the quality of my tenants. I want tenants who would pay rent on time. I would want tenants who would take care of my property so that I don't have to spend so much money renovating the property or refurbishing it after the tenants have left. If you could demonstrate 3 qualities: that you'll pay your rent on time, chances are you are planning to live in the property for at least 12 to 24 months minimum, and you are somebody who will take care of the flat, then it gives a landlord assurance that you are a very high quality tenant, right? So sometimes the people think that the amount of rent that you can get is everything. No, actually, as a landlord, I would care about how much the tenant is going to protect my property when I rent the property out to him or her. Really make use of that to your advantage. And how is that going to impact you as a renter after the 1st of May 2026? Well, the rent you see is not the rent you have to pay, right? I mentioned about it just now. So don't let the headline rent put you off certain properties that you might want to rent. The longer term impact, and this is where the but comes in, the longer term impact is a lot of landlords would just sell. It's really difficult being a landlord now, especially if you're an accidental landlord, somebody who bought a flat for him or herself to live in, and then life circumstances change. Maybe they move out to the countryside, or maybe they got married and they need a bigger home. I think a lot of those landlords would be so fed up if they haven't got fed up already and they just want to sell those properties. So that's going to affect the quantity of housing available for rental. We have already seen a lot of landlords selling out, so that's going to push up the supply, which will depress the cost of housing for sale, which is very good news for people who want to get on the property ladder. And we have seen that. We have seen the housing price to salary ratio slowly decreasing, especially for places like London. I wouldn't be surprised if we continue to see a slow decline going forward the next few years. So that's good news if you want to think about buying your first property. And I actually do have a lot of videos talking about how you can get on the property ladder, including how you can save for your first deposit, how you can invest so that you can speed up the time that it takes to save your first deposit. So I will link all of the video links below so that you can watch them in your own leisure. But of course, the most convenient thing for you is to just click a subscribe so that you don't miss out any of my videos, and also you can bookmark those videos so that you can watch them in your own free time. But this would, I want to caveat, this would negatively impact people who are going to rent, because it will get more and more competitive for you as a renter. So what would my advice be if you are a renter? I would say if you plan to live in a city that you are currently living in right now for at least the next 5 to 7 years, it actually makes sense to start thinking about buying a property. And I have a video up here talking about renting versus buying. And in that video, I teach you how to compare, how to make the analysis for yourself, because everybody's circumstances is different. So I would say that really is one of my most popular video. I think it's up here, and I would highly encourage you to bookmark it, save it, so that you can watch it if you don't plan to watch it right after this. So yeah, I would say right after this video, as a renter, there are 3 videos in my channel that would be really useful for you. And the first one will be rent versus buy. That is my most popular video with over 1,000 views thus far, and I'm quite proud of it. And the second one is how to save for your first home. Why is it so difficult to save, and how you can save and speed up the process of saving for the deposit for your first home. The third one is actually my first video, how to buy your first home in the UK. That's a video that I posted about 9 months ago. It's like a baby. It will really teach you the processes and the steps in how you can prepare yourself to become a homeowner. So that's all for today, and I hope you find this video useful from my new surrounding with the flowers that I got from Columbia Road Flower Market. I look forward to sharing more personal finance and property news with you in the future. Bye!